Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And today we are here to talk about a great work in the American literary tradition, or at least I think it's a great work. I don't know if you do, Junius, or not, based on our conversation before the show started. But we're discussing Billy Budd Sailor by Herman Melville, which is really not really a novel. It's really more of a novella. It's very short. You could probably read it in a day. I think most of our listeners could if they really
hmm
wanted to.
hmm
But Junius, is this your first time reading Billy Budd?
Yes, it is.
What are your thoughts? Initial thoughts?
Okay, I love Melville's prose. Always, not always have. I didn't love Moby Dick the first time I read it, but the second time I read it, I just couldn't put it down. This guy, he could narrate going to the grocery store, and I would just be hanging on every word. It's so wonderfully good. So it was a delight to read. On that front, I didn't find it terribly profound. Um, it was just more like a wonderful, like a wonderful appetizer, or a really solid meal, maybe. Maybe that's better. Like you go to like a pub and you get like a really good fish and chips or something like that. That's kind of what it felt like to me. So very much enjoyed it. Do think it's worth the read, but yeah, I'm curious to hear more about why you like it so much and what you got out of it.
Yeah, I first encountered this book in ninth grade. I took an American literature course, and this was one of the readings. And I think much of what I liked about it was the way that it sort of um, incorporates aspects of the biblical narrative into the
Hmm.
story. And I just found that to be a very striking thing. And I think at ninth grade, I had not read a ton of literature that I felt like did that in a good way. I think maybe I
Mm-hmm.
had been sort of beaten over the head, being raised in sort of evangelical Christian world. Like you get kind of beaten over the head with some bad attempts at doing that. But
Yeah.
this was sort of a refreshingly good use of that kind of
Yeah.
way of reading.
And it's kind of ironic because at one point fairly early on, he makes a remark about, well, I wouldn't want people to think that I'm trying to like be biblical and everything, which I know will put some people off. And so I want to kind of, skirt around that. And yet, from that point on, there are just a number of biblical allusions, references, echoes.
Yeah, yeah. It's like I don't mean to interrupt you, but yeah.
Yeah.
Um yeah, so I think that was what made it really interesting. And I think just the idea of the moral quandary kind of at the heart of the book raises
Mm,
some really important questions about law and ethics and how those two things aren't always necessarily the same thing.
mm,
And
mm-hmm,
so yeah, I think just as a ninth grader who was sort of coming into beginning to really think on my own or for myself, um, this was just kind of an interesting, foray into that.
mm,
Um, and so for that reason, I've always enjoyed the book, have revisited it every few years, and
mm,
excited to revisit it in this context. Um, I think this is one of I many of our books I've read before once.
mm-hmm,
This is probably one of the only ones I've read like maybe outside of like Aeneid, Iliad, Odyssey, and a few others where I've read like a bunch of times.
mm.
Um, so, anyways, it's interesting. Perhaps we could say a bit about the context behind the work before we. Maybe it would be a good idea to summarize up front the actual story too, because I feel like this is just a work that people aren't going to be quite as familiar with.
Mm.
And so I think once we do those things, then maybe we can get into the actual, kind of discussion behind the text.
Yeah.
So perhaps to start with Melville, I mean, Melville is one of those names that everybody knows. Moby Dick, of course, is a staple in American literature. But by the time that Melville wrote Billy Budd, which was really the last few years of his life, he was not commercially successful at all. He's one of those
Mm.
people that died and then got famous. But he was, I think, at this point, he was working in like a custom house in New York, which is kind of where I think he had a lot of interface with like naval
Mm-hmm.
operations as a result of that. But But that was where he got his income from, not his writing. He was still writing a little bit. He was like doing poetry, I think, for a pretty niche audience,
Mm,
um, but he wasn't popularly successful in any meaningful way. And
mm,
in fact, I think even the critics of the day were sort of dismissive of him. So he
mm,
really had a kind of sad into his life, or maybe an unjust one, based on all of the great things that we now attribute to him. So
mm,
the manuscript itself of Billy Budd, he didn't actually finish it in its entirety.
mm,
Um, so he dies, I think, in 1891, if I remember correctly. He had begun writing the book like 2 years before, and when he dies, his wife Elizabeth Melville finds the story, and if I remember correctly, she kind of um put some finishing touches on it. She like has
mm,
a little bit of a hand in tidying it up, and the
mm.
manuscript was yeah, it was like kind of a messy, like a lot of revisions and very structurally strange. He had changed a bunch of stuff, like the name of the ship, which is the Bellipotent in the book, but it was the Indomitable at the beginning in the earlier versions of the story, and just a bunch of other kind of aspects were kind of strange. So it um it also seems as though as he revised that the story got a little darker and more complex. Like I think originally it was supposed to be a fairly simple story about malice corrupting goodness, um, or destroying innocence, however you might want to frame that. But then, yeah, he just kind of makes it a little bit more philosophically complex. He adds the legal component to it, which is, I think, a huge part of the story, really. And so there's a lot going on there in his revising process. It's really
That,
not published or read by anybody until 1924. So like
mm.
25 years after, well, maybe even a little longer than that, after Melville's death. And it was originally published as Billy Budd Foretopman, which doesn't have quite the same ring to it as Billy Budd Sailor. But it's actually that time period when there began this reevaluation of Melville, and so this was kind of an important text in that recovery of of what is now a great American author. So it's kind of a weird textual history there, which perhaps colors some of the reasons why maybe Junius, like when you read this after having read Moby Dick, this just doesn't strike you as maybe one of the best works.
You have uncovered something that I had not realized, which is I appear to have read an earlier version of the text because mine is called Billy Budd Foretopman, and the ship is the Indomitable in the version that I read.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Do you know much about what the differences would be between what I read and what you read?
um, I don't think I've read that manuscript,
Mm.
but um, I know like the rank. Is he Captain Veer in your manuscript?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
because I think that may have been something. I remember reading that somewhere that maybe at one point he wasn't captain and then they made it. Um, but yeah, I don't. That's interesting. Um, very
Hmm.
interesting. Okay, well, the more you
So if
know.
anything comes amiss, and I'm like, wait, that's not what happened, then we'll know what's going on.
We can't get away from these two manuscript
So,
stories after
in fact, from
Frankenstein.
now on, we're only going to be doing books that have, a contested manuscript tradition.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yes, Billy Budd Sailor and Deutero Billy Budd Sailor. Um,
Well, and look, we did the no, we did Brothers K, which was finished.
yes,
So yeah, I was thinking we had another one like that, but I don't know that we have.
maybe.
Yeah. Anyway,
Well, interesting. We can't get
yeah,
away from it.
that's right.
Um, well, I'll be curious as we talk through everything. I do think that chapter divisions are slightly different in some of
Mm,
the later ones. Like I'd be interested to know um more about that, but I think that would involve a lot more, reading side by side.
hmm.
Um, so putting aside the textual issues for a moment, perhaps one other kind of important thing that is in the background of this story is some kind of incidents in naval history.
Yeah.
Um, so the basic gist of this, or the reason this is important, is that Billy Budd begins the story on a merchant vessel called the Rights of Man,
Hmm.
which is somewhat of an ironic name, I think.
Hmm.
He is drafted into the, well, not drafted. What do they call it?
Impressed.
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 Impressed into the British Navy during what I guess is the Napoleonic War.
Mm.
Um, when his ship runs up against, basically encounters a British naval ship. So they would just go onto the deck of these merchant ships and just kind of pick people that they wanted to come serve in the Navy for the.
Yeah, it was just that was really fascinating to me that Melville makes the comment that the Indomitable, as I know it, set forth intentionally undermanned because they didn't have enough sailors available to man it fully, and so the plan was to fill out the ship's complement by impression. And that this was happening a lot in those days because the needs of the Navy is that the Navy was huge in patrolling massive areas, and they just couldn't get enough people to volunteer to be Navymen, to be shipmen. And so impression was a regular part of the plan for how they were going to get the ships manned.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. So Billy Budd is he's I think the only person, at least in the manuscript that I have,
Yeah,
who's impressed from the Rights of Man onto the Bellipotent or the
that's right.
Indomitable. Um, Now, fun fact, the average British merchant sailor did not enjoy being told, actually, you have to do this thing where now you might get killed in battle, even though you didn't sign up for it.
Hmm.
So there was a
Can't
kind
imagine
of,
why.
right, there was a kind of naval crisis going on at this time
Hmm.
because there had been a multiple mutinies in these impressed ships,
Hmm.
or ships made up of large impressments. Sailors would just refuse orders in mass. I think one of them was called the Spithead Mutiny. Um, there, I think the demands were for economic thing, like they wanted better pay and they wanted better food and better living conditions. And um, anyway, so there was that story. There was the Norm Mutiny, um, which was kind of a demand for political reform and for the crew to have veto power over officers and things like that. So there's a lot going on there, and you can understand why the Rights of Man would be a ship name that Melville might choose, kind of given that this is a big controversy going on. But also, what this does, and the reason that it plays an important role in the story is that it created an atmosphere of tension in the British Navy, especially at that time. So officers were extra sensitive to the reality or the possibility of mutiny
Hmm.
being a very real possibility that they might face. And so what you get is as this becomes more of a problem, the officers begin cracking down a little bit more. So there's no tolerance for disobedience. People who do disobey have a sort of expedited court martial process. There is a kind of draconian enforcement of discipline. Um, and, I think at one point, captains are basically being told it's better to execute too many rather than too few. It's either
Hmm.
you or them. So
Yeah.
you better go ahead and, better be safe than sorry. Now,
Yeah.
um, part of the naval law was that, if you were to strike an officer, a superior
Hmm.
officer during wartime, it's an automatic capital punishment.
Yeah.
And so they would call a drumhead court, which were like courts convened on the spot, which were designed really for speed, right?
Hmm.
They're not really like how our courts should function, which is, actually due process. It wasn't really about that. It was about just getting this done so that we can take care of the problem and hopefully, it doesn't snowball into something bigger.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot going on there that's really important. I mean, a couple of things to just to highlight a bit more. If you're on a merchant ship, so you're there under a contract that details what your obligations are and what kind of pay you can expect, and it's almost like profit sharing coming out of it in a lot of instances. And you're taken from that into a military ship where you have much. You have many fewer rights, and it's not just that you're exposed to potential death by battle, which you absolutely are during these Napoleonic, the French Revolutionary period, but also you're subject to military discipline, which means just a harder life about ship in general, being pressed harder, and then these heightened tensions after these mutinies. All of those punishments, even the little punishments, are heightened because they're really trying to keep strict discipline on the ships. The Spithead Mutiny was almost like a strike.
Yeah.
It's like it's
Yeah.
like a work stoppage. We're not gonna do the stuff until you give us better pay. The Nor Mutiny was a bit more because they were pushing for a fairly large overhaul of how the naval structure worked in general. The Spithead Mutiny ended in concessions to the sailors, and no one died.
Right.
The Nor Mutiny was crushed, and 29 people were executed at the end of those mutinies. But I think one of the reasons they're so significant is because they it's kind of it's actually hand in glove with the French Revolution, right? Because the French Revolution really attacks the notions of the sanctity of the monarchy and of the feudal system and these sorts of things. And that's kind of what's going on here is this sort of sanctity of the chain of command and the officers and the admiralty and all of that was being called into question. Um, and so you have to act differently. If you remember in Hamlet, when Laertes is coming to leading a rebellion, right? He's got a mob of people behind him coming to demand the head of the king for the death of Ophelia. And Claudius stands forth and says, "Let him come." There's a divinity hedges round the crown, and he can meet him one on one without guards, confident because the monarchy itself is going to protect him. The Laertes is going to be slow to strike out. The admiralty and the officers had that kind of inviolability, or at least the sense of it before. And these mutinies really were a clear message that you can't count on that anymore. And that's one of the reasons why there's a real intense focus on we've got to keep discipline really sharply because there can't be any question in the men's minds about whether they're going to obey or whether they can get away with something or whatnot. The drumhead corps, as I understood it in this text, the drumhead corps is actually not the standard procedure. The standard procedure would be for the captain to just declare judgment and string the guy up right away. In our instance, the drumhead corps was brought about because the captain wanted to spread the responsibility around so that it wasn't seen to be a unilateral action. But it was yeah, that's the central tension that you were bringing up earlier in the ethics of the text is the truth of the nature of Billy Budd and what's maybe just in his case versus what is legally demanded in his case.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And on the topic of drumhead courts, one could understand why a captain might want
Mm.
that sort of moral support undergirding an action like capital punishment, especially of a sailor like Billy, who's well loved by most of the crew. Um,
Hmm.
it's not just it kind of protects him in some ways too,
That's
right?
right.
Like, don't it's not just me. This whole group of people found him guilty.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the actual story itself. Maybe summarize kind of the broad strokes, and then we can get into some more specifics. So as we already mentioned, Billy Budd is impressed onto this warship. Billy is a almost Adamic figure. He is
Hmm.
innocent. He is kind. He is almost functionally naive. Is the
Hmm.
way that you might describe him.
And beautiful.
And beautiful. That's right. He is beautiful. And when he's impressed, he has a moment where I think he's my read of it is he doesn't mean anything by this other than what he says, which is farewell to the rights of men, which of course he means the ship, but
Hmm.
there's a kind of double entendre that he accidentally makes there because
Yeah.
he's being impressed. And this ends up kind of factoring into some accusations that are made against him later, but he's brought onto the ship and he integrates pretty seamlessly into the life of the ship. He's very well liked by everyone. Even the people who at first maybe don't like him are won over just by spending time with him.
Hmm.
But there's one character on the ship, John Claggart, who is um, just a bent man,
Hmm.
and the innocence that Billy has really rubs him the wrong way. He can't stand
Hmm.
it. He hates it. And so as Billy becomes more well liked and more prominent on the ship, Claggart seems to despise him more. Though Claggart is very nice to Billy in terms of when they, cross paths, he'll smile at him or joke with Billy. But there's a kind of inner rage and inner smoldering that's occurring there as they interact. At times it's said that Claggart just kind of stares at Billy. Clearly, it kind of gets into Claggart's skin,
Hmm.
just how much he dislikes him. And so Claggart comes up with this idea that he's going to he's going to falsely accuse Billy of trying to organize a mutiny. Um, and this is, of course, a very serious accusation. He makes it to the captain, Captain Veer. Um, and Veer, I don't think really believes Claggart at any point. But
Yeah.
because of the seriousness of the accusation, they have to call Billy in. And
Yeah,
when
in
they,
part because if Claggart is falsely accusing Billy, then Claggart himself comes under, I think, capital punishment as well.
Mhm.
And so he has to do his due diligence all around because the making of this accusation is going to have to issue in some serious consequence one way or another.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing about Billy, and this is mentioned early in the text, is that in some situations he develops a stutter.
Hmm.
And so when Veer confronts him with these accusations that are made against him, Billy begins to stutter. The words can't come up. And Veer realizes that something's kind of going wrong, so he very fatherly tries to, help Billy along. But the nicer Veer is, the more Billy wants to respond, and so he gets really flustered. And finally, because when he can't speak, he just punches Claggart right in the face, and Claggart falls over. He ends up dying. They bring in the surgeon to verify
Yeah.
that he's dead, and he is in fact dead. And so there has to be a court called, the
Yeah.
Drumhead Court. I guess there doesn't have to be, but Veer does. He convenes this court, so he calls a couple other officers in.
Partly because, as you said before, Billy is universally, now that Claggart's dead, nobody who doesn't like Billy remains on the ship, right? Everybody else loves this guy. And so you don't want to be the captain that hangs up the most beloved man on the crew, of the crew's little darling, on for something that you claim he did below decks when no one was there to see it. That's not a good mutiny prevention strategy.
No, it's not. It's not. If anything, this makes it more likely.
Yeah.
And um, so the other officers, I think their inclination is they want to kind of know the facts of the case. Like they want to know,
Hmm.
well, what was why would Claggart lie about this mutiny, these kind of things. And Veer is very insistent. Like the only thing that matters is, did Billy do this? And if
Hmm.
he did, then that's it. You can't take into account motive or anything like that.
Hmm.
Um, there's some disagreement. It seems like at least the surgeon disagrees with Veer's whole sort of approach to this, which he says we should just put him in the brig and then wait till we rejoin the rest of the fleet and let the admiral handle all this.
Yeah.
But Veer, I think, given the panic of the moment, is insistent that they have to take care of it now.
Yeah, he's afraid that it'll if he leaves any questions in the men, then that will turn into the potential mutiny, especially among the impressed men. There's a number of impressed men on board, and he's especially concerned that they're going to see, wait, one of ours is locked up and we don't really know the circumstances of it and maybe we need to do something about it, right?
So the court condemns Billy, convicts him, condemns him to death at dawn by hanging. So they gather the crew, and Billy is, yeah, brought forward and hung, um, which is yeah, it's interesting. Um, did your manuscript have the seabirds circling where they Billy's body is committed to the sea?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that happens. They commit the body, and some seabirds are kind of around the watery tomb. Um, and then everybody has to go back to work. The Later on in the story, kind of towards as the resolution is coming, Veer is mortally wounded by a ship called the Atheist. At least my version was, it's a French ship, so it's the French word for atheist, but still, it's
Mm.
the Atheist, and
Hmm.
his last words are Billy Budd,
Yeah.
so it clearly haunts him. And there's at the very end of the story then a ballad called Billy and the Darbies, which was supposedly written by a fellow foretopman, in which Billy is speaking from the irons the night before his execution, and the voice is a little different, right? It's not quite the same character. There's
Hmm.
clearly a mythic kind of transposition that occurs in the Billy and the Darbies. But the point, right, is Billy is this iconic innocent martyr, and his story continues on in the song that they're singing and stuff. So
Mm.
anyway, so that's the
Yeah.
story. I don't know, was there
And
anything in
my
your
mine ends with this with the song. Does yours as
yeah.
well? Okay. Yeah, I think that that's a really good summary of everything. The one thing that I wanted to, well, no, I think this is probably getting into discussion at that point, so
Well,
I'll
we
leave that.
can. Now is the time.
Very well then, let's do it. So you mentioned that Billy Budd is this Adamic kind of figure, and I think that's right. I'm really grateful that you said Adamic and not Christic, because I think that's accurate. Even though he is hanged on a tree, as it were, from the yardarm, but he's not Christic. There's several times when he is described as by other characters and by the narrator as being without original sin, and it's always it's never done so strongly, at least by the narrator, it's not done so strongly as to say like, yes, I am asserting metaphysically that there is no original sin in Billy Budd, but rather it's that, you have the impression of that pre-fallen nature. The other characters seem pretty convinced that he actually doesn't have original sin. And then on the other hand, there's Claggart, who is described as, it's like, why did he do it? The answer is some men are just bad. They just got gone wrong somewhere, and Claggart was one of those who went wrong, right? And so you wind up with this, the blameless human like Adam, and then the accuser like Satan, who's just bent. Lewis calls Satan the bent one in the Ransom trilogy. Um, and there's the collision of these things, and so Claggart then is in the position of God, having to determine between these guys. And in that light, I think it's really fascinating that, as the reader, Melville has been building us up to love Billy and have no sympathy for Claggart, and you see Claggart doing this, and he's so cool about it too, right? I mean, he gets pressed several times by the captain to be like, are you sure this is the accusation you want to make? And he's just like, sir, it's my duty to report what I know. And he's just, everything he can to make it feel right. And you get that bad feeling you get when you know someone's being railroaded, but there's nothing you can do about it. But the captain doesn't really for a moment believe Claggart. I think you're right that he doesn't even entertain it. He's actually a really good judge of character. And he's like, I know how to spot a liar, and this man's lying. And so if Billy Budd had been able to hold it together, it's nearly a certainty that he would have been exonerated and Claggart would have been the one to hang rather than him. So it's just fascinating that interplay of the sinless one accused wrongly before the knowing, tempted to say all knowing, judge, right? But then it goes awry because the sinless one sins,
Hmm.
and that changes everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Much of the much of that hatred between Claggart and Billy Budd to me is kind of encapsulated by a quote by one of my favorite theologians named Herbert McCabe,
Hmm.
who's a British Dominican, who says, "If you do not love, you will not be alive. But if you love effectively, you will be killed." In other words, Billy Budd's innocence
Hmm.
is so, it not intentionally, but just by existing, it is antagonistic to Claggart,
Hmm.
who then has to lash out with violence at it because
Yeah.
that's the only way he can. He doesn't, there's no, he can't accept it and move on. I mean, I guess this is kind of similar to the prologue of John's gospel, right? That
Mm.
the that the light's not recognized, or that, the darkness tries to overcome the light,
Hmm.
that struggle. It continues in this story, certainly. um Now, it's interesting. So I think you're right. I mean, I think it's primarily that we should read Billy Budd as Adam. That said, though, there are aspects of the trial that make me like I would be more inclined to see Veer as a Pontius Pilate type.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because the whole point of the drum corps is to wash his hands, not of all responsibility, but of sole responsibility, right? To spread it out as much as he can. And for the most part, during the proceedings, like he kind of recuses himself and stands over by the porthole, not really taking part of it,
And
until it comes time to deliberate, and then he takes a very heavy hand when deliberation time comes about.
yes. Now, of course, I suppose a very literal reading of the text, the striking out at Claggart is somewhat of a it's a kind of fall.
Hmm.
But there's perhaps another reading of it where, the proto evangelion is that Christ will, or the seed will crush the head of the serpent, and that's
Hmm.
quite literally what Billy Budd does to Claggart.
Hmm.
um
Hmm.
and the fact that the ship is able to sort of go back to a kind of peace or serenity because of the death of Billy Budd,
Hmm.
perhaps there's more to that than,
Hmm.
I don't know.
I was with you until there, and so let's back up and let's say that the thing that is I think is crucial here, which is people whenever people see a character suffering unjustly in a story, they start throwing a Christ figure at it, and so I think it's important as readers of literature to be very clear what a Christ figure is, like what are the qualifications for a Christ figure. It's not no being a martyr is not enough to be a Christ figure. Even being killed unjustly is not enough to be a Christ figure. There's got to be a sense of dying for someone else. There's got to be a sense of, dare I say, substitution in it, um, and also a sense of reconciling God and man, right, or something along those lines. Now, you were reaching for the second of those at the end, saying that his death brings a kind of peace back to the ship. Um, I would argue that there was no loss of peace on the ship because the claims are entirely fictitious. The ship is actually working great, and in life, he is a peaceful presence on the ship. He was that on his merchant ship at first. The His old captain complains when he's being taken away because he said, "Look, my crew was a mess, and this guy comes on board and he made everybody love each other and has made this thing work harmoniously. You're taking away the linchpin of my crew." And he seemed to have a similar role on the new ship. It's actually, the way the soldiers respond to the notice that he's going to be executed, the way they respond at the execution themselves. I was awaiting a mutiny. I thought that it was actually going to come, and I don't get the sense that his death sort of, restores peace. It's rather the ship survives the disruption of his death, manages to avoid a mutiny.
Yes, I think you're right. I think you're right. I guess the reason I emphasize the bringing of peace after the death, though, is because even the sort of accusation of mutiny is enough to, I think, throw things awry a bit. And so, for that reason,
Certainly scares the officers quite a bit.
Billy Budd becomes a kind of scapegoat.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Um,
right. And so, here I'll say this in the direction of, he's like Christ to the extent that Christ is a second Adam. But I think he winds up being like Christ by being an Adamic figure. And so those overlaps come out of his Adamness rather than anything else. I think that in the decisive moment, he doesn't turn into a Christ figure. But yeah, there is that scapegoat. We're going to put our hands on you, and all the sin passes to you, and then we're going to send you out. Except that, in the scapegoat situation, again, the scapegoat's done nothing wrong, and he stands guilty of a breach of the military code of law.
right. The only other, I guess, way in which you could say he brings about peace is that he does remove Claggart,
Yeah,
which I guess you could say Claggart, until he brings the accusation, hasn't done anything monstrously wrong. But given the way he's described, it is sort of a fox in the henhouse kind of situation. Like if
yeah.
it wasn't this, it seems like he's so bent, something else would have happened.
What's
Um,
fascinating to me is I don't know what kind of story Melville wanted to be writing,
right,
um, because it falls short of being a tragedy, I think.
right,
And I think if Claggart had not been killed by the blow, then I think it would be more of a tragedy. Because then Claggart would be able to exalt over him and he would have the victory because he would still have to be hanged. I mean, just
right.
striking the officer is enough to be hanged. And so, and I'm glad for that. Like I remember I found myself consoled by the fact that Claggart didn't get to live to see that his assault had worked, although not in the way that he had intended. And that what he had hoped to bring down on Billy, he brought down on his own head, in addition to bringing it down on Billy's head. That was very satisfying to me, and that satisfaction is precisely what renders it non-tragic, right? It's sad. It's really um, it's a I don't know what the right word is because I don't want to say, sometimes we use tragic in a trite sense. And that's kind of the word you want to reach for in this moment, but it's not tragic in a proper sense. It's not Hamlet, And I don't know if that was if I don't believe Melville was trying to write a tragedy because he's good at tragedies. You see that in Moby Dick.
Right.
And so I think he would know how to do it. And so then the question is, so what is he really after with this? Now, I'm not trying to get us bogged down in discerning from beyond the grave author intent. I'm just trying to think of, how do I think about this story as a whole? Because it comes off more like this is just a bit of a history, and this is the curious case of Billy Budd, and there's no real genre to put it into. This is just a relation of the facts and what happens, and he presents it that way. And maybe he's at pains to keep it from being easily reducible to another genre for just that reason, so that you encounter it as this strange anecdote of something that happened at sea.
Well, I think that is the question in many ways, because it doesn't actually seem like Melville had a singular objective in
Yeah.
writing the story. I mean, it seems like it changed and it evolved, and who knows if he had actually lived to finish it, what it would have looked like in its really final form. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is
And
it
there's
is
always that
particular.
question when an author doesn't finish a text. Did he not finish it because he died? Or did he not finish it because he abandoned it before he died? Right. And of course, we cannot know. But just for a second to entertain the possibility that it was abandonment rather than interruption, it may be that as he's putting it together, he realized that he didn't have a vision for bringing it all together. And he couldn't kind of figure that out. And he was like, well, I like what I've done. It's good. It's a really good story, but it's just not going anywhere. It just turns into just this one thing. That's a possibility. Um, I don't think that, again, I want to be very clear. I liked this text. I'm glad you had me read it, and I recommend others read it. It's very delightful. I mean, in a weird sort of way, because it's also kind of sad, but it's delightful reading. It's a good yarn. I don't think that I'm not saying that it's flawed because it doesn't have a message or something like that. But I do just wonder what I'm supposed to take away from it.
Hmm.
Right. At one level, like you could just think, this is just making people aware of how how hard things were in the wake of the mutinies, like what the pickle that the British Navy was in, or it could be the very central question that you raised right at the beginning about this conflict between morality, justice, and ethics.
Yeah, perhaps we could talk about that for a few minutes. Though
Yeah, let's do.
before we move on too much about unfinished texts, I want to tell you that this past week in my medieval exegesis class, our professor was talking about Bonaventure and how he had died, in the middle of writing a text. And so some Bonaventurian scholars will say that, well, that was clearly the most important text. And the professor was like, well, just because you die in the middle of writing a text doesn't mean it's the most important text. He's like, when I die, there's going to be lots of notes all around, and they're not really that important.
That's right. In this instance, it was the most important text, but not because he died in the middle of it. It's just
Right.
the what we have of it is enough to show that it ties everything together.
That's right.
But
Speaking of
that's another
Bonaventure,
story and shall be
that's
told another time.
that's right. So it seems to me as though in a perfect world, you would have order, justice, and legality, right?
Yes.
And they would
Yes.
all work together in harmony because each
Yeah,
of
they'd
those
never be in
speaks
conflict, right?
right. Each of
Yeah.
those speaks to slightly different things, right? Justice is the act. The legal is the process by which the act is brought about, and then the order is the sort of effect of the act.
Hmm.
So if I steal $100 from you, that was unjust. What is just is for me to repay you. So there is a legal sort of restitution that is made. And the effect of it is that now things have gone back to how it should have been or how it was. Order
Hmm.
has been restored. You now have your money back. I no longer have the money that I unjustly gained. So
Yeah.
those three things should be working in harmony. I think one of the interesting questions that this text raises is in an imperfect world, are there times where we have to select one or two of those things at the expense of the other,
Mm. Yeah.
right? Because the way Veer responds in the trial and then in the execution of Billy Budd is legal.
Mm-hmm.
It is what the process demands,
Mm-hmm.
and it is for the effect of order.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it does that or not, I mean, I guess it does in this instance. Whether it would have in other instances, who knows? But it seems as though, and I think most readers would probably agree with this, that order and legality comes at the expense of justice.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, just to spend a little bit of time motivating that it may not be just for him to be executed. Because you could look at it and say, well, look, he killed a man. So he is rightly executed for killing a man. Like that's what happens when you kill people. If you don't like it, don't kill people. Which by the way is great advice, listeners. Don't kill people.
You heard it here
But
first.
that's right. But I think that in
Classical
this,
Mind
we have this
anti-murder
distinction.
podcast. Sorry.
Classical mind, officially against murder. But we have this distinction between murder and manslaughter for just this reason. That, yeah, sometimes you take an action that results in the death of a human being, but your aim wasn't the death of the human being. And our legal intuition is that, and it's not even our legal intuition, it's our justice intuition that's then been codified in law, is that those two things aren't the same. And that in one instance, the highest penalty is demanded, whether you think that should be death or something else. And in the other instance, a lesser penalty should be. You should still have a penalty. You shouldn't just be able to be responsible for the death of a human being without any consequences. Again, we're excerpting war and that whole sort of scenario here. I'm not trying to say that soldiers are come under this, but nevertheless, it shouldn't be treated the same as someone whose goal was to end another human being. So I think if that intuition holds that manslaughter and murder are rightly different things, that reflects something true in the order of justice, it's quite clear that Billy Budd's action here was manslaughter and not murder.
Hmm.
And what the military code does is the military code disregards that whole thing because it takes an even a lesser offense than manslaughter, which is just striking an officer, period, even if he doesn't die, and elevates it to the level of a capital offense because contextually it's important to cut off the dynamic that would issue in the striking of an officer. Right.
Mhm.
So I think you're absolutely right that in this instance we do have um, and are meant to feel a conflict in the order of justice and in the order of law.
And there are other extenuating circumstances to consider too. I mean, it's certainly true. Billy doesn't intend to kill Claggart. There's no plan in place or anything like that. It's kind of a heat of the moment thing. There's also the stutter,
Hmm.
which seems to indicate a loss of control or a loss of. In other words, I don't think Billy
Yeah.
is rationally choosing to do what he does. He
Yeah.
he does it kind of out of an almost animalistic
I would
response.
agree. It's because like what the stuttering thing, it's when he gets really emotionally worked up that his stutter comes out. And now he's so emotionally worked up that he can't even stutter, like he can't make it. It's like he's like right, and all of that stuff is just bottled up. And yeah, I would agree. I was about to say, I'm not convinced. I'm convinced that he did not intend to kill Claggart. I'm not convinced he even intended to hit him,
Right.
right? Which is, I think, is what you're saying. I think it's just his internal his spirit is trying. Augustine says in the beginning of the Confessions that as a baby he had these internal desires, but he had no means of communicating those to the people outside of him. And I felt like that's what was going on with Billy Budd. And the only his my body mind sort of spontaneously landed on, I'm just gonna hit him as a way out of it. So it's even at the level of, if Claggart hadn't died, even at the level of, did he really intend to strike him? Or was he put in a situation in which, he was so oppressed by his inability to respond to these ridiculous charges that that's just sort of what happened? But again, the military code doesn't care. You struck an officer, it's the yardarm for you.
Right. The other sort of interesting feature of the case, or what we might say would be an extenuating circumstance, at least in a civil court or a civilian court, would be that Claggart, in being killed, Claggart receives the punishment he would have gotten anyways.
Yeah,
Like
that's right.
as soon as he brought the false accusation to Captain Veer, that was just.
Yeah. Or I should say, it's certainly correct under the military code, right? That bringing a false accusation of a capital offense brings the death penalty down on you. Is it just in the broader sense? I mean, in a civilian court, would we put someone to death who accuses someone else of a capital crime?
Well, I suppose with the stakes what they are here, and Claggart knowing those stakes,
Hmm.
this would be more of like an attempted murder rather than an
Yeah,
actual murder. So
that's right.
perhaps yes, perhaps there's not a complete justice there in terms of the death penalty being administered to the a false accuser as well. Um,
Okay, but then I'm going to go the other way with it. I'm going to say, what should happen to a man who lays a trap for another man's life? The fact that he failed to achieve his aim of murder, should that change the fact that he attempted murder, right? That's what he was after.
hmm.
Um, uh,
Legally, we do make that distinction.
we do legally make that distinction, and it turns out to be another instance of, do our intuitions about justice and law line up there? And I
Right.
think that may be a fuzzier area for some people than others. I mean, I would. I don't know what I think about this, honestly. I mean, I'm not a lawyer or a jurist, but I would say that, on the strength of the standard that Jesus lays down in the Sermon on the Mount, that thoughts are real. And so if you even think about adultery, if you say in your heart, you fool, you've committed murder against your brother, um, I feel like I know from that how those things are considered before the divine justice, which is ultimately the standard of justice, right? So in that sense, I could come around to your earlier claim of saying, no, Claggett really does deserve to die because he knows Billy's innocent. He has no grounds for disliking him. He just dislikes him because Claggart, is a jerk. And he tries not to have him embarrassed or not to have him demoted or something like that, but to have him killed, right? To go straight to, I'm going to get this guy executed. It's pretty despicable. But regardless of what the how severe the law ought to have been, Claggart certainly receives the due punishment for his action forthwith, right? I mean, Billy is not slow in executing justice on Claggart.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. So then would we describe Veer's overall posture in the way he prioritizes sort of the legal and the order over justice as a kind of pragmatism?
Hmm. I would. Well, there's a good argument to be made for that. Not just because he's privileging the immanent over the transcendent, if you will.
Hmm.
And so you could say that that's one aspect, one feature of pragmatism, but also in the sense that both in the reason for the immanent being decided the way that it is, which is also a reason why Veers feels the need to stick to the letter of that military law, is a pragmatic concern of let's not have a mutiny. Right. So there is certainly something pragmatic to it, but I like to think that it's more noble than that. Um, I I think that yes, the chain of command is pragmatic, but I don't think it's only pragmatic. I think the chain of command is also a deeper thing about the nature of what an army or a military is, and about the way, even just the way that responsibility gets assigned within that, right? I mean, chain of command is supposed to give the soldier confidence to know that he can act as he's told without having to get into a bunch of, gray moral areas in following those orders or not. I'm not saying it works that way, but that's kind of the part of what it's meant to do, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Veer's character is very interesting. I mean, and if he wasn't occupying this particular role, I think I would like him very much.
Mm-hmm.
He seems like a genuinely good person. He
Mm-hmm.
likes to read. He's kind of more educated than the average sailor. Like he's always bringing books to sea with him, a big chest of books. Um, and they call him Starry Veer as a nickname. So in other
Mm-hmm.
words, he does have a kind of higher view of things than just a reductionistic one or a pragmatic one. Um, so I think you're right. I think he is thinking about other things um, than just how do we avoid a mutiny. He does want that, but yeah, I think you're right. I think there's something about the well, and that's kind of the order question, right? It's like he wants to preserve order, and that's really important to him. And
Yeah.
yeah,
I would like to read a little bit from his
yes,
argument to the drum court. Um, this is the officer of the Marines. By the way, the Marines are the soldiers on board. They're not sailors. They're soldiers who are there to fight in ship to ship. They board the other ship, or if you need to discharge soldiers onto land for any reason, right? And the officer of the Marines says, "Surely Bud purposed neither mutiny nor homicide." To which Veers responds, "Surely not, my good man. And before a court less arbitrary and more merciful than a martial one, that plea would largely extenuate." And in the sense of arbitrary, I don't think we're meant to hear that in a negative turn, as oh, the military court's arbitrary, it just does whatever it wants,
right,
but rather in the etymological sense of it's strictly bound by will, right?
indiscriminate.
Yeah. At the last assizes, it shall acquit, which means to say at the final judgment before God, when it comes to does Billy get into heaven or hell, he says, this very thing you've alleged will be sufficient. He'll be judged innocent at the last judgment, right? But how here? We proceed under the law of the Mutiny Act. In feature, no child can resemble his father more than the act resembles in spirit the thing from which it derives. War. In his majesty's service, in this ship indeed, there are Englishmen forced to fight for the king against their will, against their conscience, for aught we know. Though as their fellow creatures, some of us may appreciate their position, yet as navy officers, what reck we of it? Still less recks the enemy. Our impressed men he would fain cut down in the same swath as our volunteers. As regards the enemy's naval conscripts, some of whom may even share our own abhorrence of the regicidal French directory, it is the same on our side. War looks but to the frontage, the appearance, and the Mutiny Act, war's child, takes after the father. Bud's intent or non-intent is nothing to the purpose. I found it fascinating that Veer summons this court in order to not bear sole responsibility and in some sense even primary responsibility for Billy Budd's execution. And then he essentially overrides the court and dictates to them the only verdict they're really allowed to give.
Yeah, it is interesting. It is interesting. He
It,
has
his
strong arguments.
it's about as convincing as Pilate washing his hands, right?
Yes, well, right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes, not an enviable position to be in. That is
No.
certainly true. And
Well, I love that you mentioned earlier that his, when he's killed, his last words are Billy Budd, which also put me in mind of Citizen Kane,
yep.
um, Rosebud. But it's great, right? Because it shows that even though he believes he did the right thing as an officer of the British Navy, in his own private conscience, he still laments it,
Hmm.
right? Um, and I think that that's probably that's the image Melville's trying to paint here. That when you have this conflict of law and justice, it is quite possible to for one person to do their duty under the law and yet despise it as an injustice within their own heart.
Hmm.
Right. And I think that's really important if you're to have judges who enforce laws that they disagree with, or um, soldiers or officers who have to follow commands they disagree with, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I often think about this of like, a person who's a Christian who has to administer capital punishment, for the state in any, just in the prison system or something,
Hmm.
I could certainly see a similar tension between those various vocations.
Hmm.
Like, well, I have to do this because it's my job as as an employee, as a state, enforcer. On the other
Hmm.
hand, as a Christian, I hate that this is something I have to do.
Yeah.
Um, and perhaps even have some problems with that. That's how we do things. But we run into these kind of tensions between various vocations in a finite world, especially a fallen, an imperfect one.
Hmm.
I mean, I think
Hmm.
Veer's uh Veer's dilemma is something we all will encounter in some way at some point in time. I mean, even
Hmm.
when it's like, I mean, I don't have a ton of money, so when I'm walking around and somebody asks me for money, like, well, that's money I can use that to feed my family.
Hmm.
So like which do I pick? Like as a Christian, I want everybody to have what they need. As a
Hmm.
citizen, I think it's really important to support, the poor in our community as well. As a
Hmm.
father, I have a particular demand on me from my own children though.
Hmm.
So it's like, how
Hmm.
do all those things get? So sometimes I have to say no,
Yeah.
in that case when somebody asks me for money on the street or something like that. So
Well, and
we
this
all are
this
going to have
is
these trade-offs, and we have
yeah.
to prioritize certain values and virtues over other ones, and hopefully we do that with the ultimate good in view.
Yeah.
But
I,
who's to
I think
say?
there's another example that's very similar that I've encountered, and you probably encountered it too in your role as priest, which is when you are a mandatory reporter,
Hmm.
right? And so, as a professor at a university, I was a mandatory reporter about certain things, and so a student would come into my office, and they're coming out of the sense of camaraderie and trust built up from with a mentor and learning from you and that sort of a thing, and it's crazy the things they feel comfortable telling you, things that maybe you're not even comfortable being told, right? But a couple of times it happened where a student starts to say something, and I don't know for sure what they're about to say, but it looks like it's going down a certain way, and I want to be there for them, both as a Christian and as a human being who cares about other humans. I want to be there for them and be able to listen and be on their side and be what they need at that moment. But I've had to say, let me stop you right there. I need you to know that I'm a mandatory reporter. And so if you tell me anything that sounds like it's got to do with rape or abuse or any of these types of things, I have to tell someone. It's not because I don't value our relationship and I don't want to be there for you, but I'm bound by this other obligation that I have to follow. And in that moment, I'm feeling the conflict between wanting to just be a friend who can just listen and not have to set a whole other machinery in motion, and being someone who has to do that. Otherwise, I then become face consequences myself that would be, really dire and have consequences for my own family and that sort of a thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think you're right. There's a lot of ways in which we experience these tensions, and that makes okay. Now we're going to get classical mind on it. That makes this text an instance of what Socrates is doing in the Republic. right? Because in the Republic, Socrates says, you want to know what a just man is? It can be hard to see justice in the individual, so we're going to blow it up big. We're going to see justice in a city because by blowing it up big, it'll be easier to understand what it is. And so what Melville's done here is he's taken a really extreme case of this. Um, I think he's totally justified in punching this jerk who was trying to get him, who was trying to murder him, but I'm bound to kill him anyway, so that we can see what it's like to weigh those things and then bring that wisdom back into the smaller, hopefully, versions of the dilemma that we'll face in our lives.
Hmm. Yes, yes. No, I think that's exactly right. Um,
Can I bring up one more example of this?
yeah.
I am, to your chagrin, a fan of the San Francisco 49ers. And this week, we won our football game. And after the game, one of our star receivers sought out another player on the other team and hit him twice. And everyone was like, "What's going on?" And in the locker room, the media asked him about it, and he was like, "When you go back and look at it on TV, it'll reveal what really happened." It was a response to something that, in my opinion, was just really childish. And so people go back and look, and they realized that earlier in the game, and we caught this on film, this other guy had punched him in the nether region after a play. It's completely unnecessary. It's just like hard, you know. You can see him kind of like hobbling away from it, and he had waited till after the game so he didn't get a penalty on his team or whatever. And so we're like, okay, there's going to be consequences for both of these players after the game. What's going to happen? The word came down today. The first player was suspended for his actions during the game. And so he's going to have to miss some play time, right? And this is one of those situations where where justice is able to, you're able to sort of, his action after the game drew broad attention to what had happened during the game, which brought a different kind of mechanism into play. But if he had responded right away, his team would have been penalized. He might have been thrown out of the game. He might have cost all the other players the game. And so I'm not saying what he did was right or wrong. I'm just pointing out this is another guy who was kind of facing two different competing claims, and that's how he chose to navigate it.
Yeah, no, that's super fast. The only podcast where you'll get a Socrates reference and then a commentary on a football fight after a game within 2 minutes of each other. Love it.
Text come in all forms.
That's right. That's right. That's right. No, I think you're right to point that out. I think of like when I was at Nashotah House, which is an Anglican seminary, they would offer confession for the students, but it was never a priest who was also a professor
Hmm.
for
Yeah.
those reasons.
Yeah.
You're putting
That's right.
someone in an uncomfortable situation.
Yeah.
Though mandatory reporter rules sometimes are a little different when you're in the confessional versus outside, but still, you just don't want to foster that. So they just would make
Yeah.
it very easy for people. But there are many situations in which you don't have the option of extricating yourself from a situation where you do have to make a tough choice that is going to involve some sort of
Yeah.
trade-off, and in an imperfect world sometimes the justice is really not perfect. Like had the San Francisco 49er player not punched the other guy after the game, would we be talking about the fact that in the middle of
That's
the
right.
game the guy did that, and would he have gotten suspended? Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
That's right.
So yes, there's always these
I never.
tensions between our various vocations, and between values that
Yeah.
are important to each of them. And so for that reason, it's yeah, it's very hard to sometimes know what the right thing to do is. When I'm acting in a professional capacity, I have to
Hmm.
do X, Y, and Z. When I'm acting in my personal life, I have to do A, B, and C, and sometimes those collide. And
Yeah. Well, I think this conversation has been super helpful for me because at the start of this conversation, if someone asked, hey, I'm looking to fit some Melville on my syllabus, we can't fit Moby Dick on, is Billy Budd a good option? And if so, like, how would I use it? I wouldn't have known what to say, but now I think I'm comfortable saying that Billy Budd it provides an opportunity to have this discussion, right? To have your students consider what it's like to be bound by competing claims. I'm thinking this because I know a lot of our listeners are teachers who are teaching literature and they listen to us because it helps them think about new approaches to reading books. A great pairing with this in a classic great books curriculum would be Sir Gawain and the Green Knight,
yeah,
because he also was bound by competing and incompatible claims to be a Christian disciple and to be a courtly knight who's free with the ladies, and he can't be courtly and chaste at the same time, and we see in that text him struggling with that. So that would be an interesting conversation partner with this text.
And a great assignment you could do for Billy Budd, I think, would be to actually have the students write portions of the trial.
Oh yeah.
If we were trying Billy Budd in this classroom, you know, split them up into different um sides, so the prosecution and the defense, and like what are the arguments you'd make, and you could have them act it out or write it or whatever. But I think it would be a really fun
Yeah.
assignment.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first time we've ever suggested assignments in classrooms. So, you know,
We're just getting increasingly practical on this
that's right,
podcast.
pragmatic. But we're not losing sight of the end either.
That's right.
Excellent. Well, anything else to add to our discussion of Billy Budd Sailor?
No, I think that's good for me.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I think yeah, if you've not read the book, definitely go pick it up. It is very short, but there's a lot to think about in it, certainly. Um, end note. Junius, do you have an end note besides Sir Gawain and the Green Knight?
So yeah, this was I was like, oh, what am I gonna do for this? And then I thought, oh, of course. Like I want them to read more Melville because I do think that in large part Melville is turning into a forgotten classic. Moby Dick is, fewer and fewer people have read Moby Dick, and that's a shame because it is so unbelievably good. But Moby Dick is not my end note because that's not fair. It's way too big. That's more like an end dissertation. My end note is Bartleby the Scrivener, which is another one, probably Melville's most famous short story, and very different to Billy Budd, much closer to Melville's own actual professional expertise. But another one of those stories that just kind of leaves you going like, huh, okay, that's that was kind of a remarkable thing. So that's my end note.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, that is a good story. Um, Mine is the movie Billy Budd the
Mm.
movie. There is a black and white film of Billy Budd, and it stars Gregory Peck as Claggart. I don't remember who the actor is who plays Billy Budd, but yeah. So it's a really good. I think it's pretty faithful to the book. They take some liberties here and there, but for the most part, for a film adaptation, I think it does a good job
Mm.
of that. So yeah, definitely check out the movie if you have the time. Good. So, Junius, our next episode is going to be on medieval exegesis, which is an interesting topic, something both you and I think, care a great deal about. Um, we're going to do this a little differently than some of our previous episodes. Most of our main episodes, we actually have an agreed upon text ahead of time. Um, we're not going to be doing that for the next one. So if you are a listener who likes to read along with us, there's really not one particular thing we can necessarily point you to say, yeah, go read this, and then you'll know what we're going to talk about. Um, are there any sort of resources that you might point someone to as we approach that episode? Like if they don't know anything about medieval exegesis and they want to kind of know going in what they should look at, any tips, advice?
What's very accessible is Dante's letter to Can Grande, which he sent with the manuscript of Paradiso. And Dante talks about in that very short letter, just a page or two, he talks about fourfold exegesis and how he believes it should be used on the Commedia as well. So that's very accessible. A letter to Can Grande, Cangrande. And if you want one more thing to go with it, the prologue to Bonaventure's Breviloquium also talks about how to read scripture. That which is reading scripture is the basis for this tradition, and then it branches out into how we read other things as well. So those are the two things that come to mind for me.
Yeah, maybe like book 1 and 2 of Augustine's on Christian teaching or something like that also
Hmm.
would do kind of a similar thing in terms of introducing
Hmm.
the four senses of scripture. But I think that'll be a really
Hmm.
fun conversation. It will be a little different than most of the other conversations that we have had and will have, because after that, for the rest of the season, we're doing books each episode.
Yeah.
But just wanted to give everyone a heads up. Next episode's going to just be a little different, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm very excited to have that conversation with you. I will have just ended a class on medieval exegesis at Catholic University, and so yeah, hopefully we'll be able to bring some of those things to the conversation. And you're just sort of a walking encyclopedia of medieval exegesis, so yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun.
I'm looking forward to it as well. And readers, we promise we'll get back in our lane after that.
That's right. That's right. Everything will go back to normal right after. So very good. Well, listeners, thanks for coming on this journey with us. And in the meantime, keep reading.